Tonight, we travel back to a time long before electric refrigerators hummed quietly in kitchen corners, before the soft blue light of a fridge door ever spilled across a midnight kitchen floor, before ice cubes clinked softly into glasses at the touch of a button. Welcome back to Velaris Sleep. Tonight, we drift gently into the kitchens, cellars, and winter stores of the past, into smoke-scented rafters, salt-crusted barrels, and the cool, earthy hush of root cellars dug deep beneath old farmhouses. There was a time, not so very long ago, when keeping food from spoiling was not a matter of flipping a switch. It was a slow art, passed quietly from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from master to apprentice. It depended on salt gathered from the sea, on smoke rising patient and blue through timber rafters, on the deep cold breath of a cellar dug into the earth, and on the long, cooperative memory of a village that knew, together, how to make a harvest last through a whole hard winter. Let your body sink a little deeper into the mattress now. Let your eyes grow heavy. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to do, except listen and drift as we walk slowly through the quiet history of how people once kept their food alive without a single humming machine. Chapter 1. The Ancient Roman Larder. Let us begin in Rome. Not the Rome of marble senates and marching legions, though those things existed too, somewhere beyond the kitchen walls. Let us begin, instead, in the quieter Rome, the Rome of a modest household kitchen, its walls warmed by the low glow of a charcoal brazier, its air thick with the smell of olive oil and dried herbs hanging in loose bundles from a beam overhead. Picture, if you will, a woman standing before her larder in the late afternoon light. The sun outside has turned the color of honey, slanting low through a narrow window, and somewhere in the street beyond, a cartwheel creaks slowly over uneven stone. She is not hurried. She has done this 1,000 times before, and her hands move with the quiet ease of long familiarity. Her larder is a small stone room, cool even in the height of summer, tucked away from the sun on the shaded side of the house. Along its shelves rest earthenware jars, their clay bodies rounded and heavy, sealed with wax or cloth, or a thick layer of oil poured carefully over the top. Inside one jar, olives rest submerged in brine, their skins slowly softening, their bitterness fading into something rich and savory. Inside another, strips of fish lie packed tightly in salt, layer upon layer, pressed down beneath a smooth stone to keep them submerged. It is worth pausing here, in this small, cool room, to think about salt itself, because in the Roman world, salt was not simply a seasoning. It was survival. It was currency. It was, in fact, so central to daily life that soldiers were sometimes paid a portion of their wages in salt, a practice some believe gave us the very word we still use today for wages, salary. Whether or not that origin is entirely certain, the truth beneath it remains. Salt was precious, and a household with a full jar of salt was a household with a measure of safety against the year ahead. Salt worked its quiet magic by drawing moisture out of meat and fish, leaving behind an environment where the tiny organisms of decay could not easily take hold. A piece of pork, buried in salt for several weeks, would slowly transform, its flesh firming, its flavor deepening, its danger of spoiling receding month by month. The Romans layered their meats in wooden barrels or clay vessels, salt between each layer, and left them to rest in the cool dark of the cellar, patient as the turning of the seasons. But salt alone was not the only guardian of the Roman kitchen. There was also the strange and famous sauce the Romans called garum, a fermented fish sauce made by packing small fish, sometimes whole, sometimes with their innards, into large vats with salt, and leaving them beneath the open sky to slowly break down over weeks in the warmth of the sun. The scent of a garum factory, it must be said, was not a gentle one. It was sharp, briny, almost overwhelming to those unaccustomed to it, and yet, in careful small measures, garum became one of the most beloved seasonings in the Roman world. Its salty, savory depth stirred into stews, drizzled over vegetables, mixed into sauces for fish and meat alike. There is something worth noticing in this, that fermentation, which today so many of us think of as a modern health trend, was in truth one of humanity's oldest and most patient forms of preservation. Long before anyone understood the tiny world of bacteria and enzymes, ordinary people had learned, through generations of quiet observation, that certain foods, left to sit in salt or brine for the right length of time, would not rot away into ruin, but would instead transform into something new, something tangy, something long-lasting, something safe to eat months after it was first prepared. Let us step outside the kitchen for a moment, into the cool hush of early evening, and imagine the wider system that made Roman food storage possible. Beneath many Roman villas and public buildings ran networks of underground rooms, cellars carved into rock or built from stone, kept naturally cool by the earth pressing in on every side. Grain, one of the most vital staples of Roman life, was stored in such underground chambers, sometimes lined with clay to keep out moisture, sometimes raised slightly off the floor on wooden slats to allow air to circulate gently beneath the sacks. Grain was the quiet backbone of the Roman world. Wheat, barley, and other grains fed not only wealthy households but the enormous population of Rome itself, a city that swelled, by some estimates, to nearly 1 million people at the height of its power. Feeding such a city required extraordinary organization. Grain shipped by sea from Egypt and North Africa, stored in vast public granaries along the coast, distributed slowly through the seasons to prevent both spoilage and shortage. The Romans understood, in a way that feels remarkably practical even today, that the difference between a well-fed city and a starving one often came down to careful storage, steady humidity, and protection from rats, insects, and damp. Olive oil, too, held a quiet place of honor in the Roman larder, poured generously over cheeses, over vegetables, even over the tops of preserved meats. Oil created a thin seal against the air, slowing the process of spoilage in whatever it covered. A wheel of cheese, submerged beneath a layer of oil in a sealed jar, might last for many months, its flavor growing sharper, more complex, as the weeks passed by. And then there was drying, perhaps the oldest and simplest preservation method of all. In the warm Mediterranean sun, fruits such as figs and grapes were laid out on woven mats or flat stone rooftops, left to shrink and sweeten under the steady heat of the day. The scent of drying figs, sweet and slightly caramelized, would drift through a courtyard for days, mixing with the dust of the street and the distant smell of bread baking in a neighbor's oven. Dried figs, raisins, and other fruits became essential winter foods, carried by soldiers on long marches, sold in the markets of every Roman town, tucked away in the corners of larders as a small sweetness to break the monotony of salted meat and grain. Let your mind rest here for a moment in this imagined Roman evening. The woman in her kitchen has finished her small task at the larder shelf. She steps back out into the courtyard, where the last light of day catches the pale stone walls, turning them the soft color of warm bread. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once and falls silent. The air smells of wood smoke, of olive oil, of drying herbs, of the faint mineral tang of the sea carried in on an evening breeze from the nearby coast. She closes the wooden door of the larder gently behind her, and in that small, cool room, the slow work of preservation continues without her. Salt drawing moisture from meat, brine softening olives, oil sealing cheese against the air, all of it working patiently through the night while the household sleeps. It is a comforting thought, in its own quiet way, that even while people slept, even in a world so distant from our own, food was being kept safe through methods both simple and deeply wise. No machines hummed in the dark, no compressors clicked on and off through the night, and yet the food remained safe, sustained by salt, by oil, by smoke, by the deep cool breath of stone cellars, and by knowledge passed down so carefully that it survived long after the empire itself had faded into history. And it is to that next layer of knowledge, the ancient, patient craft of salting, that we will now turn our attention more closely, following its thread not only through Rome, but backward and forward through time, into the cold coastlines of the north and the quiet farmhouses of medieval Europe. Rest now, if you like, in the warmth of that Roman evening. Let the scent of olive oil and drying figs settle over you like a blanket. There is no need to remember every detail. There is only the slow unfolding of history, moving gently forward, chapter by chapter, toward sleep. Chapter 2. Salt, the Ancient Guardian. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a salt marsh in the late afternoon. The wind moves low across shallow pools of water, and the light catches on their surface in 1,000 small, trembling flashes. Nothing moves quickly here. The work of making salt has always been slow, patient, dependent on sun and wind and time rather than on any human hurry. Long before refrigeration, long even before the rise of Rome, people across the ancient world had already discovered one profound truth, that salt, in the right amount and the right conditions, could hold spoilage at bay almost indefinitely. It is worth sitting with that idea for a moment in the hush of this chapter, because it is easy to forget just how remarkable it once seemed. A piece of meat, left untouched in open air, would begin to turn within a day or two, especially in warm weather, but that same piece of meat, packed carefully in salt, might remain edible for months, even years. The ancient Egyptians understood this well. Along the banks of the Nile, where the desert heat pressed down relentlessly for much of the year, salt became essential not only for preserving food, but for the elaborate rituals of mummification, in which natron, a naturally occurring salt compound, was used to draw moisture from the body itself. It is a strange thought, perhaps, to place beside a chapter on cooking and kitchens, but it reveals just how deeply the drying, preserving power of salt was woven into the daily and spiritual life of ancient peoples. If salt could preserve a body meant to last for eternity, it could certainly preserve a piece of fish meant to last through a single winter. Fish, in fact, may have been one of humanity's earliest and most important salted foods. Along coastlines around the world, from the Mediterranean to the cold waters of the North Atlantic, communities built their entire rhythms of life around the seasonal arrival of fish and around the careful work of salting their catch before it could spoil. Picture a small fishing village on some distant coast, its houses huddled close together against the wind, its docks slick with sea spray. The fishermen return in the early morning, their boats low in the water with the weight of the night's catch, and the whole village seems to wake at once to help with the work that follows. The fish are cleaned quickly, their scales flashing silver in the pale morning light, and then laid out in long wooden troughs, packed tightly between thick layers of coarse salt. The smell in the air is sharp and briny, mixing with wood smoke from cooking fires and the ever-present scent of the sea itself. Children help carry baskets of salt from the storehouse. Old women, their hands weathered and sure, check each layer to ensure the salt is packed evenly, pressing down gently to remove any pockets of air where spoilage might begin. Over the following days and weeks, the salt draws moisture steadily from the fish, and something remarkable happens. The flesh firms and tightens. The delicate freshness of the sea gives way to something denser, saltier, more concentrated in flavor. What was once a fragile, perishable catch becomes something that can be stored through the darkest months of winter, when the seas turn too rough and cold for fishing boats to safely venture out. This transformation was not unique to any one culture. In medieval Europe, salted herring became so central to daily life that entire economies grew around it. Coastal towns along the North Sea and the Baltic built vast salting houses where thousands of fish were processed each season, packed into barrels, sealed, and shipped inland to towns and villages far from any coastline. For many ordinary people throughout the medieval world, salted fish was not a delicacy but a staple, eaten several times a week, particularly during the many days of religious fasting when meat was forbidden but fish was permitted. It is worth imagining, here, a modest medieval household during the cold gray months of Lent. Outside, the fields lie bare and brown, the trees stripped of their leaves, the sky often heavy with the promise of more rain or snow. Inside, a small fire burns low in the hearth, and a wooden barrel sits in the corner of the kitchen, its lid slightly ajar. Within it, salted herring rests in neat rows, their silver skins dulled slightly by the salt, their scent sharp and unmistakable. The woman of the house lifts one fish carefully from the barrel, rinses it briefly in a basin of water to draw out some of the salt's sharpness, and sets it to soak for a while before cooking. This small act of soaking, of gently reintroducing moisture, was itself a quiet skill passed down through generations. Knowing how long to soak a piece of salted fish or meat so that its flavor softened without losing the preservation that had kept it safe through the winter months. Meat, too, followed similar patterns of salting across medieval Europe, though the specific methods varied from region to region, shaped by local climate, available salt sources, and long-held tradition. In some regions, whole sides of pork were rubbed thoroughly with dry salt and left to cure for weeks in cool, shaded rooms, the salt slowly working its way into the flesh, drawing out moisture, discouraging the growth of anything that might cause spoilage. In others, meat was submerged directly into a brine, a solution of salt dissolved in water, sometimes flavored with herbs, sometimes with a touch of sugar or spice, depending on what a household could afford. There is a gentle rhythm to this kind of work, one that repeated itself in countless kitchens across countless centuries. The salting of meat and fish was never a single dramatic event, but a slow, ongoing relationship between a household and its stores, checking barrels, adjusting brine, rotating pieces of meat so that all were evenly cured, watching carefully for any sign that something had gone wrong. And things did, sometimes, go wrong. Salt was not a perfect guardian. If too little was used, or if the meat was packed carelessly, spoilage could still creep in, and a household might open a barrel in midwinter only to find its contents ruined. This uncertainty is perhaps difficult for us to fully imagine today, accustomed as we are to the steady, reliable hum of refrigeration. But for the people of the ancient and medieval world, food preservation was not a guarantee. It was a practiced skill, refined through observation and experience, but never entirely free from risk. It is worth pausing here to notice something quietly moving in this history. The sheer amount of human attention that once went into the simple act of keeping food safe. Whole communities organized their calendars around salting seasons. Whole trade networks grew up around the movement of salt, from coastal salt pans to inland villages, carried by cart and ship and pack animal over great distances. In some regions, salt was so valuable that roads themselves were named for it. The old salt roads of Europe, worn smooth by centuries of carts loaded with white crystalline cargo, moving slowly from coast to countryside. As night falls now over that small fishing village we imagined earlier, let us picture the salting houses standing quiet along the harbor, their wooden walls dark with age and damp, the scent of brine still lingering faintly in the cool night air. Inside, barrels rest in careful rows, their contents slowly transforming, safe from the spoilage that would otherwise claim them within days. Outside, the sea continues its endless motion against the shore, indifferent to the quiet human ingenuity unfolding just beyond its reach. Salt, humble and ancient, made so much of this possible, not through any dramatic invention, but through the patient accumulation of knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, refined slowly over thousands of years. It asked for nothing more than time, care, and the steady rhythm of salting done well. And when salt alone was not quite enough, or when a different flavor and method were desired, there was another old and equally patient technique waiting in the wings. One that involved not the drawing power of dry crystals, but the slow, fragrant work of smoke rising through timber rafters. Let us follow that thread now into the next chapter, as we drift further into the gentle history of how people kept their food, and themselves, safe through the long nights of the past. Chapter 3. Smoke and Slow Fire. There is a smell that, once known, is never quite forgotten. It is the smell of meat hanging slowly above a low fire, the smoke curling upward in thin blue ribbons, settling into wood and flesh alike with a patience that modern life rarely allows for anymore. It is woody and faintly sweet and touched with something almost resinous, depending on the trees that fed the fire below. For thousands of years, this smell drifted through villages across the world, marking the quiet, essential work of smoking meat and fish for the long months ahead. Let us imagine for a while a small medieval village tucked into a shallow valley somewhere in northern Europe. It is early autumn, the time of year when the work of preservation reaches its quiet peak. The pigs that have fattened all summer on acorns and kitchen scraps have recently been slaughtered, and the work of turning that meat into something that will last the winter has begun in earnest. Behind many of the houses in this village stands a small structure, low and dark, built of timber or sometimes stone, with a slanted roof that traps smoke rather than letting it escape too quickly. This is the smokehouse, and on this particular evening, its narrow door stands slightly open, releasing thin trails of smoke that drift lazily upward into the gathering dusk. Inside, strips of pork hang suspended from wooden beams, their surfaces darkening slowly, taking on a rich mahogany hue as the smoke does its slow work. The fire that fuels this smokehouse is not meant to blaze or roar. In fact, the entire craft of smoking depends on the opposite instinct, a fire kept low and smoldering, often fed with green or damp wood, specifically chosen to produce abundant smoke rather than high flame. Different regions favored different woods, each imparting its own particular character to the meat. In some places, oak was favored for its steady, moderate smoke. In others, applewood or beech gave a gentler, slightly sweeter note. Along certain coastlines, Where trees were scarce, people turned to peat, its smoke thicker and earthier, giving fish and meat a distinctive, almost mineral flavor that some communities came to prize above all others. The process of smoking worked through several quiet mechanisms at once, though the people practicing it understood these mechanisms through experience rather than science. The heat, low as it was, still helped draw moisture from the meat, much as salt did, creating an environment less hospitable to spoilage. The smoke itself, meanwhile, coated the surface of the meat with compounds that further discouraged the growth of anything harmful, while also imparting flavor, and in many cases, a protective outer layer that helped seal in what moisture remained beneath. It was common, in fact, for smoking to be paired with salting rather than used entirely on its own. A piece of pork might first spend several weeks resting in salt, drawing out much of its moisture, before being moved to the smokehouse for a final stage of preservation and flavor. This combination, salt first, smoke after, became one of the most enduring food preservation partnerships in human history, one still echoed today in the smoked hams and bacons found in kitchens around the world. Let us step inside that smokehouse a little further, in our imagination, and notice the details that might have greeted someone entering on a cool autumn evening. The air inside would be warm, though not uncomfortably so, thick with a haze that stung gently at the eyes before they adjusted. Rows of meat would hang at different heights, some pieces closer to the fire and further along in their smoking, others higher up, still pale and early in the process. The wooden beams themselves, over years of repeated use, would have taken on a deep, blackened patina, smooth and almost polished from decades of rising smoke. There was a rhythm to tending such a fire that required patience rather than urgency. Someone, often an older member of the household with long experience in the craft, would check the smokehouse periodically throughout the day, feeding the fire just enough to keep it smoldering steadily, never allowing it to flare into open flame, which could scorch the meat, or worse, threaten the whole wooden structure with fire. This tending might continue for days, sometimes weeks, depending on the size of the pieces being smoked and the desired depth of preservation. Fish, too, were smoked extensively across many cultures, particularly in regions where fishing formed the backbone of the local economy. Along the coastlines of northern Europe, herring and other fish were split open, cleaned, and hung in long rows within smokehouses built specifically for the purpose. The resulting smoked fish, firm and deeply flavored, could be stored for months, providing essential protein through winters when fresh fish was difficult or impossible to obtain. There is something worth noting here about the deep interconnectedness of these preservation methods with the rhythm of the seasons themselves. Smoking, much like salting, was not a task performed at random moments throughout the year, but was tied closely to specific times. The autumn slaughter of livestock, the seasonal runs of fish up rivers or along coastlines, the harvest of particular woods best suited for smoking fires. A household's entire yearly calendar might bend around these moments, with late autumn in particular becoming a season of intense, focused labor as families raced to preserve enough food before the frost and snow made such work far more difficult. Imagine, if you will, the sounds that might have filled such a village during this season. The rhythmic chop of an axe splitting wood for the smokehouse fire, the low murmur of voices as neighbors helped one another with the heavier tasks of slaughtering and butchering, since such work was rarely done by a single household alone. The occasional bark of a dog, drawn by the scent of meat, quickly shooed away from the smokehouse door, and beneath it all, the soft, steady crackle of a smoldering fire, its smoke rising unhurried into a sky already turning the deep blue of early evening. By the time winter truly arrived, blanketing the fields in snow and driving the village indoors for long stretches at a time, the smokehouse would stand quiet again, its work complete. The meat that had hung there through the autumn now rested in the pantry or storeroom, wrapped in cloth or hung from hooks, ready to be brought out piece by piece as the winter months required. A family might slice off a portion of smoked ham to flavor a pot of simmering vegetables, the rich, smoky aroma filling the kitchen and mixing with the scent of wood smoke from the hearth fire, creating a warmth that went beyond mere temperature. This method of preservation, ancient as it was, proved remarkably durable across time and geography. The Vikings, whom we will visit more closely in an upcoming chapter, relied heavily on smoking to preserve fish and meat through their long, dark northern winters. Colonial Americans, arriving in a new and unfamiliar land, brought with them the smoking traditions of their European homelands, adapting them to new woods and new game as they built their own smokehouses in forest clearings far from the villages their ancestors had known. There is a certain comfort in recognizing how widely shared this practice became. How many different peoples, across so many centuries and so many different landscapes, arrived at similar solutions to the same basic problem. Fire, patiently tended, smoke, carefully directed, time, allowed to do its slow and steady work. No two smokehouses were quite identical, shaped as they were by local wood, local climate, local tradition, and yet the underlying wisdom remained remarkably consistent, a quiet thread of shared human ingenuity running through village after village, century after century. As the fire in that imagined smokehouse burns low tonight, its embers glowing a soft, deep orange in the darkness, let yourself rest in the thought of all that patient, unhurried labor that asked for nothing more than time and steady attention, and that rewarded a whole village with meat and fish that would carry them safely through the coldest, hardest months of the year. And when the smoke finally settles and the fire fades to ash, there remains yet another old and gentle method still waiting for us. One that relied not on fire at all, but on the simple, patient power of sun and open air. Let us turn now toward that quieter craft as we drift onward into the next chapter of this long, slow history. Chapter 4: Sun, Wind, and Drying. There is a particular stillness to a summer afternoon spent watching something dry in the sun. Nothing moves quickly. The air shimmers faintly with heat, and time seems to slow to match the unhurried pace of moisture slowly leaving fruit, leaving grain, leaving fish laid out along a rocky shore. Of all the ancient methods of preservation, drying may be the oldest and the simplest, requiring nothing more than sun, wind, and patience, three things that cost nothing and that every culture, in every corner of the world, had in some measure. Let us drift first toward the Mediterranean, where the sun in late summer presses down with a warmth that seems to soak into the very stones of the hillside villages. Picture a rooftop in such a village, flat and pale beneath the open sky, scattered with wooden trays or simple woven mats. Upon them rest figs, split gently open, their pink flesh exposed to the heat above. Nearby, bunches of grapes lie spread in loose clusters, their skins slowly wrinkling as the sun draws the moisture from within, transforming them slowly, over days, into raisins sweet and chewy and full of concentrated sugar. The work of drying fruit like this required little active labor once the fruit was laid out, but it demanded constant, gentle attention. Someone in the household, often a child, given the simplicity of the task, would need to turn the fruit periodically throughout the day, ensuring even exposure to the sun, and would need to gather everything in quickly if clouds gathered or rain threatened, since a sudden shower could ruin days of careful drying in a matter of minutes. There was a kind of quiet vigilance to this work, a small but constant awareness of the sky, of the wind, of the subtle signs that might warn of changing weather. The scent of a rooftop covered in drying figs was warm and faintly caramelized, sweet without being cloying, mixing with the drier, dustier smell of sun-baked clay tiles beneath. In the late afternoon, as the heat of the day began to soften into evening, this scent would drift down into the streets and courtyards below, mingling with wood smoke from cooking fires and the earthier smell of olive trees stirring gently in the first cool breezes of dusk. Grain, too, depended heavily on drying, though in a less delicate and more essential way. After harvest, sheaves of wheat or barley were often laid out in open fields or threshing yards to dry thoroughly in the sun before being stored, since any lingering moisture within the grain could lead to rot or mold during the long months of storage that followed. This drying stage was quiet but critical, and farmers watched the sky with real concern during harvest season, knowing that a poorly timed rainstorm could threaten the safety of an entire year's food supply. Let us travel now, gently, toward a very different climate, the cold, wind-scoured coastlines of the far north, where the sun offered little of the warmth found along Mediterranean shores, but where the wind itself became the primary tool of preservation. Along the rocky coasts of Norway and Iceland, fishermen developed a method of drying fish that required no salt at all, relying instead on cold air and steady wind to draw moisture slowly from the flesh over the course of weeks or even months. Picture a wooden drying rack, tall and simple, standing along a windswept shore where the sea stretches gray and restless toward the horizon. Upon this rack hang whole fish, usually cod, split open and cleaned, their pale flesh exposed to the relentless wind. In the cold northern air, where temperatures often hovered near freezing even in the milder months, the risk of spoilage from warmth was far lower than in southern climates, allowing fish to dry slowly and steadily without the need for salt to draw out moisture more forcefully. This dried fish, known in various forms across Scandinavia, became remarkably hard and light once fully dried, almost like a thin plank of pale wood, rather than anything one might immediately recognize as food. And yet, when soaked in water for a day or more, it would soften and swell, returning to something resembling fish once again, ready to be cooked into stews or eaten alongside bread and butter. This dried fish could last for years under the right conditions, making it one of the most reliable and long-lasting foods available to northern communities, carried on long sea voyages, traded inland to communities far from the coast, and stored in household lofts as a steady, dependable food source through even the harshest winters. The sound of wind moving through rows of drying fish racks must have been a familiar one in these coastal villages, a low, steady whistling, punctuated by the occasional creak of wooden supports shifting slightly under the strain of a stronger gust. Gulls would circle overhead, drawn by the scent of fish, though kept at a respectful distance by watchful dogs or by nets stretched loosely over the racks to protect the drying catch. Herbs, too, were dried extensively across nearly every culture that practiced any form of preservation, hung in small bundles from kitchen rafters where they would slowly lose their moisture in the warm, dry air near the hearth. Thyme, rosemary, sage, mint, these and countless other herbs were gathered at the peak of their season, tied with string, and hung upside down to dry, filling kitchens with a soft, fragrant haze that lingered gently in the air for weeks. Dried herbs, once fully preserved, could be stored in small clay jars or cloth pouches, ready to season a winter stew or to steep into a warming tea during the cold months when fresh herbs were nowhere to be found. There is something worth noticing in this quiet chapter of history about the relationship between climate and craft. In the warm, dry Mediterranean, the sun itself did most of the work of drying, and the primary skill lay in timing and vigilance. In the cold, damp north, it was the wind and the steady cold that did the essential work, and the skill lay instead in patience, in understanding how long a fish needed to hang before it was fully preserved, in reading subtle signs of texture and weight to know when the drying was complete. Across the wider medieval world, drying remained one of the most accessible and widely practiced preservation methods, particularly for households that lacked the resources for extensive salting or smoking. Dried peas and beans, dried apples cut into thin rings and strung along strings to hang near the hearth, dried mushrooms gathered from autumn forests and threaded onto twine. All of these became quiet staples of the medieval pantry, requiring little more than time, air, and a watchful eye. Let us imagine, one more time, an autumn evening in some modest village, the kind of evening when the last golden light of the day slants low across a garden where strings of drying apple rings hang from a wooden frame, turning slowly in a gentle breeze. The air carries the sweet, slightly tart scent of apples mixed with wood smoke drifting from a nearby chimney. Somewhere inside the house, a kettle begins to sing softly over the fire, and the woman of the household steps out to gather in the driest of the apple rings before the evening dew can settle and soften them again. This is the quiet, unhurried rhythm that drying required, a rhythm dictated entirely by weather and season, by sun and wind, and the careful attention of hands that had done this same work many times before, in many autumns past. There was no urgency in it, no dramatic transformation happening all at once, but rather a slow and steady accumulation of small changes, day by day, until fruit became something that would last through winter, until fish became something light and durable enough to carry across the sea, until herbs became something that could season a meal many months after the plant itself had withered in the first frost. As the light fades now on this imagined autumn evening, and the apple rings are gathered safely indoors, let us carry this same slow, patient feeling forward into our next chapter, one that takes us further north still, into the long, dark winters of the Viking world, where drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting all combined into a single, resourceful way of surviving some of the harshest conditions the human world had to offer. Rest now, if you wish, in the gentle image of that quiet garden, apple rings turning softly in the evening breeze, and let yourself drift onward, slowly, toward the next part of this long and peaceful history. Chapter 5. The Viking Winter Stores. Far to the north, where the summer sun barely dips below the horizon before rising again, and where the winter darkness stretches long and deep across fjord and mountain, there lived a people who understood, perhaps better than almost anyone else in the ancient world, what it meant to prepare seriously for a season of scarcity. The Norse settlements of Scandinavia and Iceland faced winters of such length and severity that food preservation was not simply a helpful skill. It was the difference between a village that saw spring again and one that did not. Let us imagine a Viking longhouse settling into the deepening dark of early winter. Outside, snow has begun to gather along the eaves, and the wind carries with it the particular cold, mineral scent of a fjord beginning to freeze at its edges. Inside, the longhouse glows with the warm, low light of a central hearth fire, its smoke rising slowly upward through a hole in the thatched roof, mixing with the scent of drying fish hanging from the rafters above. The Norse people relied on nearly every preservation method we have already wandered through in earlier chapters, often combining several at once within a single household's stores. Fish, caught in great abundance from the cold northern waters, was dried extensively on wooden racks along the shore during the milder months, taking advantage of the same steady, cold wind that dried fish so effectively along the Norwegian coast. This dried fish, light and long-lasting, became one of the most essential foods of the Norse diet, stored in great quantities to last through the darkest, coldest months when fishing became difficult or altogether impossible. But the Vikings also embraced fermentation with a particular devotion, developing methods of preserving food that might seem unusual to modern sensibilities, yet that provided essential nutrition through the depths of winter. Perhaps the most distinctive of these was a method of fermenting fish, in which fish, often shark in Iceland's particular tradition, was buried in the ground or placed in a container to ferment slowly over a period of weeks or months. The Icelandic Greenland shark, whose flesh is toxic when fresh due to naturally occurring compounds, became safe to eat only after this long process of fermentation, during which those harmful compounds slowly broke down. The resulting food carried a famously strong scent, one that most modern visitors to Iceland still describe with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. Yet for the communities who relied on it, this fermented shark represented a vital source of protein through months when fresh food was scarce. It is worth pausing here to reflect on how deeply resourceful this kind of preservation truly was. The Norse people did not simply tolerate the challenges of their environment. They studied it closely, generation after generation, learning which foods could be transformed through fermentation into something safe and nourishing, even when those same foods might otherwise pose a genuine danger. This was knowledge built slowly, through trial, through careful observation, through the accumulated wisdom of countless households facing the same long winters, year after year. Dairy, too, played an essential role in Norse winter survival, and here again fermentation proved invaluable. Milk from cows, goats, and sheep, gathered through the warmer months, was transformed into a variety of preserved forms that could last far longer than fresh milk ever could. Skyr, a thick, tangy fermented dairy product still enjoyed in Iceland today, was made by curdling milk with a small amount of bacteria culture, then allowing it to thicken slowly over time. This skyr could be stored for extended periods, providing essential protein and nutrients through the winter months, when fresh milk production slowed considerably, as livestock themselves struggled through the cold, lean season. Whey, the liquid remaining after milk had been curdled and strained, was not discarded but carefully preserved as well, often used as a preservation liquid in its own right. Meat or other foods could be submerged in whey, its natural acidity helping to inhibit the growth of harmful bacteria, extending the safe storage life of whatever was submerged within it. This practice reflected a broader Norse philosophy of preservation, one in which almost nothing was wasted, and every part of an animal or a harvest was considered for its potential to be transformed into something that would last. Let us imagine for a moment the storage areas of a Norse settlement during the depths of winter. Beneath the longhouse, or in a separate small structure built specifically for storage, one might find rows of wooden barrels and clay containers, each holding a different preserved food. Dried fish, stacked in neat bundles, their pale, papery flesh rustling faintly if disturbed. Barrels of skyr, thick and tangy, kept cool in the naturally low temperatures of the storage room. Containers of preserved meat, submerged in whey or packed in salt when it was available, though salt itself was often more precious and harder to come by in the northern reaches of the Norse world than it had been in Rome or medieval Europe further south. Grain, where it could be grown in the shorter, cooler growing seasons of the north, was carefully dried and stored as well, though Norse communities often supplemented grain with other staples better suited to their harsh climate. Root vegetables, where cultivated, were stored in cool, dark spaces, buried in sand or straw to protect them from frost, while still allowing enough cold to keep them from sprouting or rotting prematurely. There is something worth noting about the particular psychological weight that winter preparation carried in Norse society. The literature and sagas that survive from this period often reflect a deep cultural awareness of winter's danger, a recognition that a poorly prepared household might not survive until spring. This awareness shaped not only individual family practices, but broader community structures as well. Norse settlements often worked cooperatively during the key preservation seasons, sharing labor during the autumn slaughter of livestock, during the height of the fishing season, during the collection and preparation of whatever wild foods the surrounding land might offer. Foraging, in fact, played a significant role in Norse food preservation, particularly the gathering of berries during the brief but intense northern summer. Cloudberries, lingonberries, and other hardy northern fruits ripened quickly during the long days of summer light, and communities would gather them in significant quantities, preserving them through drying, through fermentation into simple wines or preserved fruit mixtures, or by packing them in containers with a small amount of available sugar or honey, when such luxuries could be obtained through trade. Let us imagine, now, the deep quiet of a Norse winter night, far removed from the activity of preservation season. The longhouse rests wrapped in snow, its low profile designed specifically to withstand fierce winds and heavy snowfall. Inside, a family gathers close around the hearth fire, its light casting long, warm shadows across timber walls hung with drying herbs and, perhaps, the last remaining strips of dried fish from the season's stores. Someone ladles a portion of preserved fish, softened through soaking and gentle cooking, into a simple stew thickened with whatever grain or root vegetable remains in the household stores. The scent of this stew, earthy and slightly smoky from the hearth fire, fills the low-ceilinged room, mixing with the ever-present smell of wood smoke and the faint, mineral tang of the cold air seeping in around the edges of the door. Outside, the wind moves steadily across the frozen landscape, carrying with it the distant sound of ice shifting somewhere on the fjord, or perhaps the low, mournful call of an Arctic bird passing overhead in the darkness. Inside, however, there is warmth, however modest, and there is food, preserved through months of careful, patient labor, sustaining this small household through a winter that might otherwise have proven fatal. It is worth remembering, as we drift onward from this chapter, that the Norse world we have just wandered through was not separate from the wider currents of medieval history, but existed alongside them, trading, raiding, and settling across much of northern Europe, and even reaching, in their longships, as far as North America centuries before other European explorers would follow. Their preservation methods, shaped so specifically by the harshness of their environment, represent one of the most resourceful adaptations in this entire history we are exploring tonight, a testament to what human ingenuity could accomplish when survival depended on it so directly and so completely. As the fire in that imagined longhouse burns low, and the family settles into sleep beneath heavy furs. Let us carry this same sense of quiet resourcefulness forward into our next chapter, where we will explore a preservation method already touched upon briefly in Rome and in the Norse world, but one that deserves its own closer, gentler examination: the ancient and endlessly varied craft of pickling and fermentation. Rest now, if you like, in the warm glow of that Norse hearth fire, and let yourself drift onward, slowly, into the next quiet chapter of this long history. Chapter 6: Pickling and Fermentation. There is a particular kind of magic in fermentation, though the people who first practiced it would not have used that word. To them, it was simply a quiet transformation that happened when certain foods were left, under the right conditions, in salt water or vinegar, for days or weeks at a time. Cabbage became something tangier and more complex than cabbage. Cucumbers became something sharp and satisfying that could last through months when fresh vegetables were nowhere to be found. It was a process that asked very little of the people who practiced it, beyond patience and a willingness to trust in something they could not see happening deep within a covered crock resting quietly in a cool corner of the kitchen. Let us imagine, for a while, a modest medieval kitchen in the weeks following the autumn harvest. Baskets of cabbage sit stacked near the hearth, their pale green leaves still slightly damp from the morning's picking. A large ceramic crock rests nearby, wide-mouthed and heavy, waiting to receive the vegetables that will soon fill it. The woman of the household, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, begins the familiar work of shredding cabbage into thin ribbons, her knife moving with the easy rhythm of a task performed many times before. As the shredded cabbage fills the crock, she sprinkles salt over each layer, working it gently into the leaves with her hands, pressing down firmly to release the natural moisture held within the vegetable itself. This is a crucial part of the process, for it is this released liquid, combined with the salt, that will form the brine in which the cabbage will slowly transform. A weighted stone or a tightly fitted wooden lid is placed on top, pressing the cabbage down beneath its own liquid, keeping it submerged and away from the open air where unwanted spoilage might otherwise take hold. And then, the crock is left alone. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of fermentation, when considered from a modern perspective so accustomed to constant intervention and control. The household does nothing further but wait, checking occasionally to ensure the cabbage remains submerged, perhaps skimming away any surface film that might form, but otherwise trusting entirely in a process that unfolds unseen, day after day, in the cool dark of the crock. Over the course of several weeks, tiny organisms naturally present on the cabbage itself begin to feed on the sugars within the vegetable, producing acids that lower the surrounding liquid's pH to a level inhospitable to harmful bacteria, while remaining perfectly hospitable to the beneficial organisms doing this quiet work. The cabbage slowly softens, its flavor deepening from something crisp and mild into something tangy, slightly effervescent, wonderfully complex. What emerges weeks later is a food that will keep for months in a cool cellar, providing essential vitamins through the winter months, when fresh vegetables were otherwise unavailable across much of Europe. This particular method, so familiar to us today as sauerkraut, was practiced widely across medieval Europe, particularly in regions where cabbage grew abundantly and where long, cold winters made preserved vegetables an essential part of the household pantry. Yet fermentation of this kind was hardly limited to cabbage alone, nor was it unique to any single region. Across the medieval world, and indeed across nearly every culture we have wandered through in this history, similar processes were applied to a wide range of vegetables, each community developing its own particular traditions, shaped by local produce and taste. Cucumbers, too, found their way into brine, becoming the pickles familiar to us even today, though medieval versions varied considerably depending on the specific herbs, spices, and precise fermentation methods a household favored. Dill, mustard seed, garlic, and various regional herbs were tucked among the cucumbers as they fermented, lending subtle variations of flavor to the finished product. Root vegetables, too, sometimes underwent this same slow transformation, along with certain fruits, though vegetables remained the most common candidates for this particular preservation method throughout most of medieval Europe. Vinegar, meanwhile, offered a somewhat different but related path to preservation, one that did not rely on the vegetable's own fermentation, but instead used an already acidic liquid to create an environment where spoilage organisms could not easily survive. Vinegar itself was often produced through a fermentation process of its own, typically from wine or ale that had been allowed to sour under careful conditions, transforming alcohol into acetic acid through the quiet work of particular bacteria that thrived in the presence of oxygen. Once vinegar had been produced, it became an immensely versatile preservation tool. Vegetables could be packed into jars and covered entirely with vinegar, sometimes warmed gently with spices first to enhance flavor, then sealed and stored in a cool pantry or cellar. Eggs, too, were sometimes preserved this way, submerged whole in vinegar brines that could keep them safe to eat for extended periods, a particularly valuable technique in seasons when hens laid eggs abundantly, but a household could not possibly consume them all before they would otherwise spoil. Let us imagine, now, the particular atmosphere of a medieval pantry in late winter, when the household's fermented and pickled stores had been resting quietly for many months. The air in such a pantry would carry a distinctive tang, sharp and slightly sour, mingling with the earthier scent of root vegetables stored nearby, and the faint mustiness of a cool stone room, rarely touched by direct sunlight. Rows of crocks and jars would line simple wooden shelves, their contents visible only as vague shapes through the cloudy brine, each one representing weeks or months of quiet transformation, completed long before this particular winter evening. A household member entering this pantry to retrieve a portion of fermented cabbage for the evening meal would lift the lid carefully, releasing a brief, sharp waft of tangy, slightly effervescent scent into the cooler air of the room. The cabbage itself, once golden and crisp from the autumn harvest, would now appear pale and slightly translucent, its texture softened, its flavor transformed entirely from what it had been months before. There is something worth reflecting on here, in this quiet chapter, about the deep trust required in fermentation as a preservation method. Unlike salting or smoking or drying, all of which involved fairly direct and observable transformations, fermentation asked people to trust an invisible process guided by organisms far too small to see, working according to natural laws not yet understood in any scientific sense during the medieval period. And yet, through generations of careful observation and inherited knowledge, ordinary households across Europe and beyond mastered this trust completely, relying on fermented and pickled foods as an essential, dependable part of their yearly food supply. This same fermentation wisdom appeared, too, in the Roman garum we encountered earlier, in the Norse skyr and fermented fish, and would appear again, as we shall see, in the pickle barrels and root cellars of colonial America. It is a thread that runs continuously through this entire history, connecting distant cultures through a shared, patient understanding of how time and careful conditions could transform food not into something spoiled, but into something wonderfully, safely new. As the light fades on this imagined medieval evening, and the pantry door closes once more on its rows of quietly fermenting crocks, let us carry this sense of patient trust forward into our next chapter, where we will descend, quite literally, into the cool earthen dark of another essential preservation space, the humble but remarkably effective root cellar. Rest now, if you wish, in the gentle tang of that pantry air, and let yourself drift onward, slowly, toward the next part of this long, unhurried history. Chapter 7. The Root Cellar's Quiet Kingdom. There is a particular coolness that greets anyone stepping down into a root cellar, a coolness that has nothing to do with the season above ground. Step down a few earthen stairs, push open a low wooden door, and the air changes entirely, growing still and slightly damp, and carrying the deep, mineral scent of packed soil that never quite dries out, no matter how hot or dry the summer above may become. This was, for many centuries, one of the most quietly essential spaces in any household that hoped to survive a long winter. A simple hole dug into the earth, and yet capable of holding back the passage of time in remarkable ways. Let us imagine such a cellar, dug beneath a modest farmhouse somewhere in medieval Europe, though root cellars of one form or another appeared across nearly every culture we have wandered through tonight, from ancient granaries to Norse storage pits, to the cellars that would later be dug by colonial families in America. The cellar itself is small, perhaps only large enough for a person to stand upright in its center. Its walls formed simply from the packed earth itself, occasionally reinforced with stones or timber to prevent collapse. A set of rough wooden steps leads down from a trapdoor above, and the only light comes from whatever lantern or candle a visitor might carry down with them. The genius of the root cellar lay not in any complex mechanism, but in a simple and elegant use of the earth's own natural properties. Soil, several feet beneath the surface, maintains a remarkably steady temperature throughout the year, insulated from the extremes of summer heat and winter cold by the sheer mass of earth surrounding it. A cellar dug deep enough would remain cool even during the hottest days of summer, and would resist freezing even during the coldest nights of winter, hovering instead in a narrow, stable range that proved ideal for storing many kinds of food for extended periods. Root vegetables, as the name of this space suggests, were the primary beneficiaries of this natural refrigeration. Carrots, turnips, beets, potatoes, once they arrived in Europe from the Americas, parsnips and onions, could all be stored in a well-maintained root cellar for many months, provided they were handled with the proper care. Often, these vegetables were packed in boxes or barrels filled with slightly damp sand or straw, a technique that helped regulate moisture around each individual vegetable, preventing them from drying out too much, while also protecting them from the excess moisture that might otherwise encourage rot. Let us imagine the particular care that went into preparing a root cellar for winter storage in the days following a successful harvest. A farmer and his family might spend an entire afternoon carrying baskets of freshly dug vegetables down into the cellar, brushing away loose soil but leaving a thin protective layer intact, since scrubbing vegetables too clean before storage could damage their skins and hasten spoilage. Each vegetable would be inspected carefully, any damaged or bruised specimens set aside for immediate use rather than long-term storage, since a single spoiling vegetable could spread rot to others packed closely around it. Apples, too, found a natural home in the root cellar, though they required slightly different handling than root vegetables themselves. Often, apples were wrapped individually in paper, or layered carefully with straw between each piece, laid out in single layers within wooden crates rather than piled together, since apples release a natural gas as they ripen that can hasten the ripening and eventual spoiling of vegetables and other fruits stored nearby. A careful household would arrange their cellar with this knowledge in mind, keeping apples in their own designated corner, away from the potatoes and carrots that might otherwise be affected by their presence. The atmosphere within a well-stocked root cellar during the depths of winter must have been a remarkable thing to experience. Imagine descending those rough wooden steps on a bitterly cold February evening, lantern light flickering against earthen walls, the air growing steadily cooler and more still with each step downward, until finally reaching the cellar floor itself, surrounded on all sides by the quiet abundance of a successful harvest. Bins of carrots, their orange forms dimly visible in the lantern's glow. Barrels of potatoes, their pale skins dusted faintly with the sand in which they rested. Crates of apples, their sweet scent mingling faintly with the deeper, earthier smell of the soil itself. Perhaps strings of onions, hung from the ceiling beams to cure and store in the drier air near the cellar's entrance, away from the more humid depths where root vegetables preferred to rest. There is something worth pausing on here, in this quiet underground chamber, the sheer trust that this space represented. A family stepping into their root cellar in the depths of winter was, in a very real sense, stepping into the physical manifestation of their entire autumn's labor, all of it preserved and waiting patiently in the cool dark, sustaining them through months when the fields above lay frozen and bare, offering nothing fresh to harvest. Root cellars varied considerably in their construction, depending on the resources and geography available to a particular household. In regions with suitable hillsides, cellars were sometimes dug directly into a slope, allowing for a door at ground level on one side, while still achieving the deep earthen insulation needed on the other sides. In flatter regions, cellars were dug straight down, accessed by a trapdoor and steps, sometimes located beneath the main house itself, other times built as a separate small structure a short distance away, its low mounded roof covered in grass or earth, blending almost invisibly into the surrounding landscape. This last detail is worth lingering on for a moment, in the spirit of slow, gentle observation this history calls for. Many root cellars, viewed from a short distance, would have appeared as little more than gentle mounds in the earth, perhaps topped with grass or even small shrubs, their true purpose invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the household's arrangement. Only the small wooden door, often set low into the mound, would reveal the presence of the storage space hidden within. Ventilation, too, played a subtle but important role in a well-designed root cellar. A small vent or pipe, positioned carefully to allow a gentle exchange of air without permitting significant temperature fluctuation, helped prevent the buildup of excess moisture or the stagnant, close air that could encourage mold and rot among stored vegetables. Farmers learned through generations of experience precisely how much ventilation a cellar required, adjusting vents seasonally as outdoor temperatures shifted, opening them slightly more during milder autumn weather, sealing them more tightly as the true cold of winter set in. Let us imagine, one final time, the quiet satisfaction of a household checking their root cellar on a calm winter morning, snow perhaps lying softly across the mounded earth above, the air outside sharp and clear and cold. Stepping down into the cellar, a farmer might run his hands over the bins of carrots and potatoes, checking for any early signs of sprouting or spoilage, perhaps removing a few vegetables that showed the first soft spots of decay, ensuring the rest remained safe for the months still ahead. Satisfied, he might select a handful of carrots and a few potatoes for that evening's supper, climbing back up into the pale winter daylight, the cellar door closing softly behind him, sealing in the cool, patient dark once more. This simple, ancient technology, nothing more in truth than a hole dug thoughtfully into the earth, sustained countless households across countless centuries, asking for nothing but careful construction, seasonal attention, and a bit of quiet trust in the insulating patience of the soil itself. It required no fire, no salt, no elaborate process of transformation, only the earth's own steady, unhurried temperature, offered freely to anyone willing to dig deep enough to receive it. And yet, even the root cellar had its limits. It could keep vegetables and fruit cool and safe from freezing, but it could not produce true cold in the way that ice itself could. For that particular kind of preservation, a coldness deep enough to slow spoilage even further, to keep meat and dairy safe through the warmer months, to create the particular luxury of a cool drink or a frozen treat even in the height of summer, communities would need to turn to an entirely different resource, one gathered not from the earth, but from the frozen surface of winter lakes and rivers. Let us follow that thread now into our next chapter, as we climb up out of the earthen quiet of the root cellar and into the crisp, bright world of ice harvesting and ice house storage. Rest for a moment, if you like, in the cool stillness of that underground chamber, and let yourself drift onward, slowly, toward the next part of this long, gentle history. Chapter 8: Ice Houses and Winter's Gift. There is a particular sound that belongs only to deep winter, one that modern life has largely forgotten: the sharp, resonant crack of ice being cut, followed by the low, grinding scrape of a heavy block sliding across a frozen surface. For centuries, this sound marked one of the most physically demanding, yet quietly rewarding, tasks of the winter season. The harvesting of ice from lakes, ponds, and slow-moving rivers, gathered and stored away with such care that it might last, cool and solid, well into the following summer. Let us imagine a winter morning on a frozen New England pond, sometime in the early days of colonial America, though the practice of ice harvesting stretched back centuries earlier in other parts of the world, and would continue for generations to come. The sky above is a pale, clear blue, the kind that seems to belong only to the coldest days, when the air is so dry and still that sound itself seems to travel further and more clearly than usual. Breath rises in visible clouds from a small group of men gathered at the pond's edge, their heavy wool coats dusted with a fine layer of frost, their boots crunching softly over snow that has drifted against the frozen shoreline. The ice itself, by this point in the season, has grown thick enough to bear considerable weight, often 18 inches or more in the coldest regions, sometimes even thicker in particularly harsh winters. Before any cutting could begin, the ice needed to be cleared of snow, since a layer of snow resting on the ice's surface acted as insulation, slowing the ice's own thickening and sometimes creating weaker, more porous layers beneath. Men would work with long-handled scrapers and plows, sometimes drawn by horses fitted with special ice shoes to prevent slipping, clearing wide sections of the pond down to clean, clear ice beneath. Once cleared, the ice would be scored into a grid of large, even blocks, using specialized saws and cutting tools, some hand-operated, others later drawn by horse-powered equipment, as the ice trade grew into a significant commercial industry in places like New England during the 18th and 19th centuries. The sound of these saws biting into thick ice carried a particular rhythm of its own, a steady, grinding scrape, followed by the sharp crack as a block finally broke free from the surrounding ice sheet. Workers would then use long poles with hooks, called ice hooks or pike poles, to guide the freed blocks across the open water channels toward the shore, where they would be lifted, often with the help of simple pulley systems, onto waiting sledges or wagons. The physical labor involved in this work was considerable, performed in bitter cold, often with hands and feet growing numb despite heavy gloves and boots, the entire process requiring careful coordination to avoid the very real danger of a worker slipping into the frigid water. Once harvested, the ice needed to be transported quickly and stored properly if it was to survive the warmer months ahead. This is where the ice house came into its own quiet importance. An ice house was typically a simple but carefully constructed structure, often partially or entirely underground, similar in some respects to the root cellars we explored in our previous chapter, though designed with an even greater emphasis on insulation, since the goal here was not merely to keep food cool, but to prevent solid ice from melting at all across the full span of an entire summer. The walls of a well-built ice house were often doubled, with a significant gap between the inner and outer wall filled with sawdust, straw, or other insulating material, creating a buffer that dramatically slowed the transfer of outside heat into the ice storage area within. The blocks of ice themselves, once brought into the ice house, were packed tightly together, with additional sawdust or straw filling any gaps between blocks, further insulating each piece from its neighbors and from the surrounding air. Let us imagine stepping into such an ice house on a warm summer afternoon. The contrast between the world outside and the world within, almost startling in its intensity. Outside, the air might shimmer with summer heat, insects humming lazily in tall grass, the sun blazing down from a cloudless sky. But pushing open the heavy door of the ice house and stepping inside, one would immediately feel the temperature drop significantly, the air growing still and cool, carrying a faint, clean scent of sawdust mixed with the cold, mineral smell of the ice itself, layered in great blocks that had been sitting patiently since the depths of the previous winter. This preserved ice served multiple purposes throughout a household's or community's warmer months. Perhaps most directly, it allowed for the continued operation of what might be called ice boxes, early precursors to modern refrigerators, consisting of insulated wooden cabinets with a compartment for holding a block of ice, which would slowly cool the surrounding compartments where perishable food could be kept for extended periods, far longer than would otherwise be possible in the ambient summer heat. A family fortunate enough to have access to an ice box, whether through their own ice house or through a regular delivery from a local ice company, could keep milk fresh for several additional days, could store meat more safely during warm weather, and could even enjoy the particular luxury of a cool drink on a hot summer afternoon, ice chipped carefully from a stored block and dropped into a glass of water or cider. The commercial ice trade that developed in places like New England during the colonial and early American periods grew into a surprisingly significant industry, with ice harvested from northern lakes and ponds shipped by boat to warmer regions, including as far as the Caribbean, and even, in some remarkable instances, across the ocean to India, packed carefully in sawdust within the holds of specially designed ships to survive the long, warm voyage. This trade required immense coordination and no small amount of financial risk, since a poorly insulated shipment or an unexpectedly long voyage could result in the loss of an entire cargo to melting before it ever reached its destination. Yet even beyond this commercial trade, countless individual households and small communities maintained their own modest ice houses, sized appropriately to their own needs rather than for wider commercial distribution. A farming family might harvest just enough ice from a nearby pond to fill a small ice house sufficient for their own household use throughout the summer months, the work of harvesting becoming an established part of their winter calendar, much as the salting of meat or the digging of root vegetables marked other essential seasonal tasks throughout this long history we have been exploring. Let us imagine, one final time, a quiet winter evening following a long day of ice harvesting, the kind of evening when exhausted but satisfied workers might gather briefly near a fire before heading home, their breath still visible in the cold air, their muscles aching pleasantly from the day's labor. Behind them, the pond lies scarred with the neat rectangular gaps where blocks of ice have been cut and removed, already beginning to skim over again with a thin new layer of ice in the bitter cold. Nearby, the ice house stands quietly full, its insulated walls holding in the deep winter cold that would, in just a few short months, provide a small but meaningful comfort against the heat of summer. There is something worth reflecting on here, in this chapter of ice and winter labor, about the remarkable foresight required to plan so many months ahead, to endure the genuine discomfort and danger of harvesting ice in the coldest part of the year, purely for the benefit of a season still far in the future. It reflects, perhaps as clearly as any other practice in this long history, just how deeply people once had to think ahead, how thoroughly their lives were shaped by the patient anticipation of needs not yet arrived, but certain to come. As we carry this sense of careful anticipation forward, let us turn now to the broader world of colonial American kitchens and pantries, where so many of the preservation methods we have explored tonight, salting, smoking, drying, pickling, root cellar storage, and ice house cooling, came together within a single household's yearly rhythm, adapted to a new and often unfamiliar landscape far from the older traditions their practitioners had carried with them across the ocean. Rest for a moment, if you wish, in the cold, clean stillness of that imagined ice house, and let yourself drift onward, slowly, toward the next part of this long, gentle history. Chapter 9. Colonial American Winter Kitchens. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a colonial farmhouse kitchen in the late afternoon of an autumn day, when the last of the harvest has finally been brought in, and the long work of preparing for winter has entered its final, careful stages. Outside, the fields lie stripped and golden brown, the trees along the property's edge beginning to lose their color to the first frosts of the season. Inside, the kitchen hums with a different kind of activity altogether, not the frantic energy of harvest itself, but the slower, more deliberate rhythm of turning a summer's abundance into a winter's survival. Colonial American households, particularly those in the northern regions of New England and the mid-Atlantic, faced winters every bit as demanding as those endured by their European ancestors, and they carried with them, across the ocean, centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to meet that challenge. Yet the New World presented its own particular circumstances, its own available ingredients, its own unfamiliar plants and animals, requiring these transplanted traditions to bend and adapt in ways both small and significant. Let us imagine, first, the smokehouse standing a short distance from the main farmhouse, its low timber walls dark with years of accumulated smoke, much as we saw in medieval Europe, though here the meat hanging within its rafters might include not only the familiar pork of European tradition, but venison from deer hunted in the surrounding forests, or wild turkey, its flesh leaner and requiring slightly different handling than the domesticated pig meat colonial families had known in their previous homes. The autumn slaughter remained, as it had for centuries elsewhere, one of the most significant events of the colonial farming calendar. Neighbors would often gather to help with this substantial task, since butchering and processing a full-grown hog, or several hogs at once, required more hands than a single family could easily provide. The day of slaughter itself would begin early, in the cold gray light before full dawn, and would extend through hours of demanding physical labor. The killing itself, the careful draining and cleaning, the methodical butchering into the various cuts that would serve different purposes throughout the coming winter. Nothing, in this careful colonial economy, was wasted. Fat was rendered down into lard, itself an essential cooking ingredient and a form of preserved sustenance in its own right, stored in crocks, where it would remain usable for many months. Intestines were cleaned thoroughly and used as casings for sausages, into which scraps of meat, fat, and seasonings were carefully packed. Even the animal's blood found its use, mixed with grains and seasonings into puddings that provided valuable nutrition and reflected a broader colonial philosophy inherited from European tradition that viewed waste as a genuine moral and practical failing in a world where every resource required such considerable effort to produce. The meat destined for longer preservation followed familiar paths, salt first, in many cases, packed into barrels with layers of coarse salt between each cut, left to cure in a cool cellar or spring house for several weeks before being moved, in many households, to the smokehouse for the final stage of preservation. The resulting hams, bacon, and other smoked cuts would then be hung in the farmhouse's own attic or in a dedicated storage room, sometimes wrapped in cloth bags to protect against insects, providing meat that could last through the entire winter and often well into the following spring. Let us step, for a moment, into the pantry of such a colonial farmhouse, a small room typically located on the cooler, north-facing side of the house, its shelves lined with the accumulated bounty of the autumn's labor. Jars of pickled vegetables, their brine slightly cloudy, containing cucumbers and green beans and beets preserved through vinegar or salt brine, much as their European ancestors had done for centuries. Crocks of fermenting cabbage, transformed slowly into the tangy preserved food that would provide essential vitamins through the long months when fresh vegetables remained impossible to obtain locally. Strings of dried apples and pumpkin, cut into rings and hung to dry near the kitchen hearth, their sweet, slightly leathery texture ready to be reconstituted in stews and pies throughout the winter. Corn, a crop entirely unfamiliar to European tradition before colonial contact with Native American agricultural knowledge, became one of the most significant staples of the colonial American pantry, and colonial settlers learned much of its cultivation and preservation directly from Native American communities, who had cultivated and preserved this crop for many generations before European arrival. Dried corn, its kernels hardened and preserved through careful drying, could be ground into meal for bread and porridge throughout the winter months, or soaked and treated to create hominy, a preparation method also learned from Native American practice. This exchange of agricultural and preservation knowledge between colonial settlers and Native American communities deserves particular acknowledgement in this history, since so much of what allowed colonial households to survive their first difficult winters in an unfamiliar land came directly from the accumulated wisdom of peoples who had inhabited and cultivated this land for countless generations before European arrival. Squash, beans, and corn together, often called the Three Sisters in recognition of their complementary growing patterns and nutritional value, formed an agricultural foundation that colonial settlers adopted and adapted, learning methods of drying and storing these crops that would prove essential to their survival through the harsh northern winters they encountered. The root cellar, too, remained every bit as central to colonial households as it had been in medieval Europe, often dug beneath the farmhouse itself, or built as a separate small structure nearby, its earthen walls providing the same steady, insulating coolness that had protected root vegetables for centuries. Colonial cellars held the familiar carrots, turnips, and onions of European tradition, alongside potatoes, which gradually became an increasingly important crop as the colonial period progressed, and the distinctly American addition of pumpkins and squash, their thick skins allowing them to store reasonably well through the cooler months when kept in a dry, cool space. Let us imagine, now, a particular scene that might have unfolded in countless colonial farmhouses across a typical New England winter. A family gathered close around the kitchen hearth on a bitterly cold evening, the wind rattling faintly against shuttered windows, snow perhaps piling steadily against the farmhouse walls outside. A large iron pot hangs over the fire, its contents simmering slowly, filling the room with a rich, warming scent that combines the smoky depth of preserved meat with the earthier aroma of root vegetables retrieved that same afternoon from the cellar below. The mother of this imagined household might step briefly into the pantry to retrieve a small portion of dried apple, softening it in warm water before adding it to a pot of porridge for the children's breakfast the following morning. The father might check, before retiring for the night, that the fire in the smokehouse still smoldered properly, its slow work of preservation continuing quietly through the darkness. An older child, perhaps, has been sent down into the root cellar with a lantern to fetch potatoes and turnips for the next day's meals. The cold, earthen air of the cellar, a familiar sensation by this point in the season, no longer novel, but simply part of the accepted rhythm of winter life. Spring houses, too, played their part in this colonial preservation landscape, particularly in regions where a natural spring provided a steady source of cool, flowing water. A small structure built directly over or alongside such a spring could maintain a remarkably stable, cool temperature throughout the year, similar in principle to the root cellar, but often better suited to storing dairy products, since the gentle movement of spring water helped regulate both temperature and humidity in ways a still root cellar could not always match. Milk, butter, and cheese, all requiring cooler storage than root vegetables typically demanded, often found their home in these spring houses, submerged partially in shallow channels of flowing spring water that kept them fresh for extended periods, even during warmer months. There is something worth noticing in this final major chapter of preservation history we have wandered through tonight, about the remarkable synthesis colonial American households represented. Here, in these modest farmhouse kitchens and pantries, the salting traditions of ancient Rome, the smoking practices of medieval Europe, the fermentation wisdom shared across so many cultures, the root cellar construction techniques refined over centuries, and the ice house innovations of the colonial period itself, all combined together with newly learned Native American agricultural and preservation knowledge, creating a rich, adaptive system capable of sustaining families through some of the harshest winters these settlers had yet encountered. This synthesis did not happen quickly, nor did it happen without considerable hardship and loss along the way, particularly in the earliest years of colonial settlement, when unfamiliar land and unfamiliar seasons claimed many lives before the necessary knowledge and infrastructure could be fully established. But across the generations that followed, colonial American households developed a food preservation system remarkably comprehensive and resilient, one that would continue largely unchanged for many generations, right up until the eventual arrival of mechanical refrigeration began, slowly and gradually, to transform the way people thought about keeping food safe. As the fire burns low in this imagined colonial kitchen, and the family settles into the quiet rest of a cold winter's night, Let us carry this sense of accumulated wisdom, this long inheritance of careful, patient knowledge, forward into our final chapter tonight, where we will gently draw this long history to its close and let ourselves settle, at last, into a restful and peaceful sleep. Closing chapter: A village falling asleep. Let us imagine, one final time tonight, a village. Not any single village in particular, but perhaps something formed from all the villages we have wandered through together across this long, slow history. Picture it settling into sleep on a quiet winter night, its rooftops dusted with snow, its chimneys releasing thin trails of wood smoke into a still, dark sky scattered with stars. Beneath this village, in cellars dug deep into the cool earth, root vegetables rest quietly in their beds of sand and straw, patient and unhurried, waiting for the morning when a careful hand might come to retrieve them. In smokehouses standing a little apart from the main dwellings, the last embers of the day's fire glow softly in the darkness, their slow work of preservation continuing even now, unattended, trusted entirely to time and careful design. In pantries and kitchens, jars of pickled vegetables and crocks of fermenting cabbage sit undisturbed on wooden shelves, their quiet transformations proceeding invisibly, hour by hour, need nothing more from the sleeping household than patience. Somewhere, perhaps, an ice house holds its careful cargo of winter's own cold, insulated, and waiting for a summer still many months away. Somewhere else, strings of dried herbs and apples hang motionless in the still night air near a banked hearth fire, their scent settling gently through a sleeping house. And everywhere, in barrels and jars and hanging bundles, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations continues its quiet work, asking nothing of the people who created it beyond what they had already given: their time, their attention, their patient, careful hands. This is, perhaps, one of the most comforting thoughts this long history offers us tonight, that even in sleep, even in the deepest hours of the night, the work of survival continued softly onward, sustained not by anxious wakefulness, but by processes trusted fully, prepared carefully in advance, and left to unfold in their own unhurried time. There was a particular kind of peace available to people who had done this work well, who had salted their meat properly, smoked it patiently, stored their vegetables with care, and could therefore rest through even the longest winter nights with a quiet confidence that morning would bring food enough to carry them forward. We have traveled a long way together tonight, from the sunlit courtyards of ancient Rome, through the salt marshes and smokehouses of medieval Europe, into the dark, resourceful winters of the Norse world, down into the earthen quiet of root cellars, out onto the frozen surface of a winter pond where ice was patiently harvested, and finally into the adapting, synthesizing kitchens of colonial America, where so many old traditions found new expression in an unfamiliar land. Through all of it, one thread has remained constant. Long before electricity, long before the quiet hum of a refrigerator became such an ordinary, unremarked feature of daily life, people understood, deeply and practically, how to work with the natural world rather than against it, with salt, with smoke, with sun and wind, with the earth's own steady coolness, with the patient, invisible work of fermentation, with the deep cold of winter ice, saved carefully for warmer months still to come. There is no need to hold on to any of these details now. Let them settle, gently, into the quiet corners of your mind, the way dried herbs once settled into the corners of an old farmhouse kitchen, the way root vegetables once settled into their beds of sand within a cool earthen cellar. Let your own body rest now, as fully and completely as those old stores of preserved food once rested safe and patient through the longest nights of winter. Thank you for spending this time with Velaris Sleep tonight. Let the wood smoke and salt air and quiet cellar dark of this long history carry you gently now into your own peaceful, restful sleep.